Hello, this is Rob and Mike from the McClellan Financial Group of Asante Capital Management, and this is ThinkSmart with TMFG. Today on ThinkSmart with TMFG, Mike and I are going to start discussing part 2 of some of the signals from the Visual Capitalist book by Jeff Desjardins and his team, and the book is entitled Signals. And we had reviewed some of them a few weeks back, and I thought it might be a good chance to talk about some of the other signals and the impact on the world and the coming years. We always talk about the difficult part about investing is you can't predict the future. And as we go through some of these symbols, you'll see that. It is hard to predict the future, but there's no doubt there are some long-term trends going on. The first one that comes to mind is the rising middle class. So, Mike, what does that mean to you when you hear that the rising middle class?
Well, we all remember when we were kids and we didn't eat our food, your parents would come and say, if you don't eat that, we're going to send it to starving kids in China. I'm sure there's still many starving kids all over the world, but the starving kids in China aren't as starving as they used to be. Because China is beginning to finally, and it's a great thing, is begin to get a middle class. It's nowhere at the same level of our middle class, but the rates of pay in China, if we went back a while ago, the average person in China was making $2 a day or less than $2 a day. Now you have people, it's risen up, half the population making between $2 and $8 a day, and the other half is making between $8 and $32. Now that doesn't seems absurd for our pay scale, but when you look at what's happened in the last 10 years in the movement, that's a huge movement. When you see pay going up by 4 to 10 to 20 times, that's massive.
I think the interesting thing about it, they've certainly come from, the rice fields, and they've become a much more industrialized nation. And with that, their population is huge. It's 800, million people. Canada's 40 million people. So just do the math there. You're going to have that many more consumers. And when they move into the middle class, often they're, whether they have office jobs, they have what they call more white-collar jobs, and some of them blue-collar jobs. They have more demands. They want a car. They want a house. They want an apartment. They want a proper food. They want to travel. They want to go to restaurants. So there's huge demand that is taking place in the world, huge change in demand. COVID may have slowed it down a little bit, but it's not going away. We wonder why things keep changing, prices keep going up. This is what's going on. It's the rising middle class.
What was the spending number? It used to be, right now the middle class spending $32 trillion, and it's expected to double in the next 10 years.
In the next 10 years.
$64 trillion. So, there's huge opportunity in there for a lot of businesses.
Huge. Will they all come from China? Will they all come from India? No, they're going to come from North America. And at the same time, what you're seeing is the middle class is growing in North America and Europe, but it's a slow growth. It's at 0.5% a year, whereas in Asia, it's at 6% a year. Yeah. So this is a huge growth stage.
As we're moving out of this Make America Great era, our last 4 years.
Glad that era's over.
So the reality is a lot of middle-class jobs did move over to China. And again, when you're watching this, when you go back in the last 4 years in the U.S., not to get political on this, but the idea that they were going to gain that back was an impossibility. It didn't make any sense. That was the one flaw in the whole Make America Great idea. They want to bring back all these middle-class jobs. But the middle-class pay in the States is very different than middle-class pay in China. So everyone wants to be able to get jobs back in America, North America. But, I go down to Best Buy, and I was looking at buying a TV. It's $400 for a TV now, for like a 32 or 40-inch TV. And I know the reality, if that was made in the U.S., it would be $4,000. I also don't want to pay $4,000 for my TV. And most people were like-minded to me. So we've really seen a change in the quality of our life through what can be provided to us. And there's been a shift. Middle class is leaving the U.S. and middle class is spreading it out the world. And it's not a terrible thing.
So I was talking about we were cleaning up the basement, and I kept every time I bought a new car, a used car, I kept all the sales slips. And so I was looking back, Ingrid and I were having a pretty good laugh. I paid $23,000 for my Nissan Pulsar. Now that was 30 years ago. You can still buy the equivalent of a car like the Nissan Pulsar today for $23,000. So some things haven't gone up in price.
Yep.
Now, you can also spend a lot more on a car that didn't exist. With the rising middle class, another trend is increased consumption, increased demands on goods and services throughout the world. So where are people spending that money? What's going up and what's going down, Mike?
Well, people were spending less money at home on food, less on transportation, less on clothes. So they moved their priorities, and priorities seem to move into health. That's people are understand they have to take care of themselves, finance, and recreation. People like to travel. It's more the experience. And it's funny, we talked about this in the past because I always used to be into buying things. You like the experience of things. And we had two different ways of thinking about spending money. It seems more people are following your model than mine.
No, absolutely. I mean, my kids who are in their early 20s, they've been to some parts of the world that I've never been to. My youngest has been to Africa on a program. My son, after graduation, he traveled to Thailand and places like that I've never been to. It's much easier to do that today. Now, obviously not during COVID. Some of these trends have stopped during COVID.
You're finding, too, the collectability of things is really dropping off. There used to be this idea where people would collect things. When you go on eBay and you try to get rid of things nowadays, when I went to clean out my parents' house, everything that my mother had dishes she thought were worth a fortune, you wouldn't get a penny for them. Yeah. No one cares about that stuff anymore. And over time, the younger generation doesn't really hold value to items. It's more about experiences.
Right. It's interesting you say that. We've tried to get rid of some stuff on Facebook Marketplace and things like that, and the prices we're giving the things away for are ridiculous. Like for $20 for something that cost $200 5 years ago. Carpets. We have this beautiful oriental carpet that we paid. We found the original bill of sale in the basement again.
Yep.
We spent $5,000 on this thing about 15 years ago.
Yep.
We can't get $500 for it today, and it's in mint condition.
Yep.
So, right, everything's changing, and it's going to continue to change. What else? What are some other trends that are going on? What are some other signals?
Well, media has changed, and we've seen a real centralization of where you get your information from. And it's got its good and its bad. And technology has moved ahead so quickly that everyone has massive access to massive information. People work differently now. You can get whatever you want. When I was a kid, I used to always go, and I like information. That's just how I work. And my favorite thing is when I was a small kid was that we had encyclopedias. We had that big set of Encyclopedia Britannicas. And I used to go and just get one and just read it. And everyone wonders why I have stupid amounts of information, because I was a bit of a geek. I read encyclopedias. And I found it was the most interesting thing. But think of what kids have at their access, at their fingertips nowadays. Like, I was blown away, and I got as much as I could out of one shelf full of encyclopedias. Think of what the kids have access to now.
So before, you get your news from newspapers. And so that's how you got most of your information. And then TV came along. And radio. And radio, well, I guess radio came first and then television. But there was often a cost to that. There was a cost for TV. Radio was pretty cheap. You just needed a radio. Newspapers, you had to buy the newspapers. They were relatively cheap. Newspapers are pretty expensive now today. I think, a weekend paper of the Star or Globe is like $4 or $5. I think you were pointing that out a few weeks ago.
Pricey now.
You go grab two or three papers and you throw down a 20. Yep. It's crazy. But today, with the internet, you've got all the news 24/7, whatever you want. And it's really hard to figure out what's real, what's not real.
And a lot of it is good. I use Yahoo for finance. It's great. I use MSN for information, the stories. Every day I get information on everything. and as it's happening.
So here's some interesting numbers. There's 4 billion people today on social media. That covers most of the world.
Yep.
It's the kingmakers these days are Google, Facebook, and Amazon. Today on digital marketing, which is where most of the marketing dollars are going, they capture 80% of digital marketing, those 3 companies alone. But the other thing that's happened, and I don't know whether I'm not allowed to say his name, even though he's a former president of the United States as of today.
Yeah.
70% of the population have lost trust in the media. And we used to believe the media was telling the truth, and now we're not so sure anymore.
Yeah. Walter Cronkite was a very respected individual. If he told you something, you knew it was true. If you got the news from Kennedy nowadays on media, you'd have to check twice.
You'd have to check twice. You may have to go to a
sources.
couple of different stations just to make sure they're all carrying the same story.
Well, I was in my. You were talking about doing cleanouts in your basement. I was cleaning out some stuff too, but I came a box of smartphones. Do you know what the old smartphones used to look like, or the old phones? Because I have a box of old phones. You forget how much they've advanced. The screens on them, you couldn't read anything on them, and they're so much bigger now and so much better. And I got to say that's one of the trends that I never realized as big as it would be. I thought these phone companies are going through the roof because, I thought they were overpriced because people are going to buy one phone and last from 5 years. Why would they keep on replacing phones? God, was I wrong?
You were wrong.
But in that, geez, Nokia is almost gone, right?
So we've talked about the media. We've talked about the rise of the middle class. We've talked about where people are spending money. There are some things that aren't very good. And, there is a rising wealth inequality. You've got a rising cost of living. You've got unequal wage growth, and we've really seen this during COVID. Those that have been affected the most are those on the lower end of the scale. The minimum wage people, for the most part, have really been impacted with unemployment, lost their jobs. And even though the government has stepped in, I'm not sure it's closed all the gap. You've seen the workers don't have as much power. The unions are down dramatically, and I'm not suggesting we bring unions back. But in the last 20 years, union percentage, I think, has gone from about 20% down to 10%. And probably it's going to go from 10 down to 5 in the next 20 years. What else? Executive compensation. What's changed in that, Mike?
Executive compensation, I always find a very interesting subject because it was a backfire by people trying to control things, right? At one time, I think it was about 20 years ago, they decided that executives were being paid too much money. And what they did was they decided in the security side of things, well, every company is going to have to make public what their executives make. And I figured, well, once they put that out there, that would cut down that executive compensation. The shareholders would go nuts and won't accept that. So this was the solution. It had exactly the opposite effect. What happened, they made executive compensation public knowledge, and the executives looked at this, and every executive said, well, I'm worth more than him. And they drove up the executive compensation where it became a competition to see who could make the most money. And the shareholders didn't care about how much they were paying for them. They just want to make sure they have the most expensive guy working for them. So it backfired in the biggest sense. And nowadays, executive compensation is just ridiculous.
Yeah, you see people. Well, the other piece that happened with that is shares. So rather than paying out the bonus, you give them shares in the company. And when you can see what happens, suddenly now they're motivated to drive up the price of the stock because they own a significant number of shares in the company.
In the short term.
In the short term,
yeah.
Right? Which isn't necessarily good for companies in the long term. But if you look at those executives, we see executives walking away with tens and millions and hundreds of millions of dollars if they get fired or if they retire.
Yeah, and sometimes to do horrible things to companies, which is, you'd think it's reasonable if they grew a company, but half the time they're being kicked out because they did a terrible job, but they still have that compensation arrangement. So
yeah, they strip money out of the company pension plan and then they retire with a $100 million package. It's crazy. So those are some of the signals, some of them good, some of them bad. The world's continuing to change. I think that's good for today. This is Rob and Mike with ThinkSmart from the McClellan Financial Group of Asante Capital Management, reminding you to live the life that makes you happy.
listening to McClellan Financial Group of Asante Capital Management Limited. Asante Capital Management Limited is a member of the Canadian Investor Protection Fund and the Investment Industry Regulatory Organization of Canada. Insurance products and services are provided through Asante Estate and Insurance Services Incorporated. This material is provided for general information and is subject to change without notice. Every effort has been made to compile this material from reliable sources. However, no warranty can be made as to its accuracy or completeness. Before acting on any of the above, please make sure to see a professional advisor for individual financial advice based on your personal circumstances. The opinions expressed are those of the authors and not necessarily those of Asante Capital Management Limited.